Round of applause for our panelists. Okay, well, thank you very much, Alice, for that intro. Just to start off with a question for you. I mean, you mentioned you've got your prediction there out to 2025. That's only 5.5 years away now. What are your thoughts beyond that? Is that curve going to accelerate further?
Yes, yeah, that's the shape it's going to take.
And what would you, when do you think we're going to reach a stage where all new vehicle sales will be EV and the internal combustion engine will be for hobbyists only, like the horses of today?
So the chart I've shown is for certain regions globally. Right now there are policies in place in certain countries, for example, Germany and UK and France, who have set a firm policy level deadline for when they will ban the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles. So the uptake was on EV sales alone, and that will partly be substituting away from people who are making choices on the purchase of vehicles. But I think it depends on the quality of the batteries in the EVs, how far you can drive. So for example, our analysis on the market in North America is that we think the life cost of running an EV is already lower than the cost of running an internal combustion engine. But say in the US, people need to drive long distances because how people live. So the choice would be affected by cost. It will be supported by battery technology and people's preference for how they want to live. So I can't predict the end of petrol vehicles, but as EVs and then consumer preferences change, and together with lower costs, then that will change people's buying behavior.
Does it also depend on where people live? So, for example, if you live in a block of flats with charging ability in the basement, as opposed to living in a suburb where you might have some sort of old power infrastructure?
Yeah, so say governments, in the Chinese government, so you live in block of flats, and then they can install the charging infrastructure for you for free on your parking lot. So that's, aside from, policies encouraging the purchase of EVs, then as the EV proliferation continues, then the governments need to think about charging infrastructure, the grid infrastructure, and then also what type of power would supply the electricity that goes into your EVs.
What's Cruise's take on fuel cells, the potential for fuel cell vehicles?
The fuel cell development is on the technology front, is the Japanese are running that show. I personally think it's related to their phase out of nuclear fuel. You may not think so, but I think it's related. In China, there are model towns and cities which are used as kind of an exercise or like a trial city for fuel cells. But I think the proliferation will take more buying and investment for that to replace lithium-ion batteries.
And how will do hybrids have a role to play in this as well? Gas-electric hybrids, because obviously you mentioned there are rural areas and things like that where people might need to be driving long distances, say in the States where you need to drive 50 miles to your local town. For those people, a hybrid would be a possible solution there.
So the preference for vehicles are also affected by policies. So say in China, so purely battery-based vehicles are preferred because how subsidies are geared towards. With some hybrids, I think there's plug-in hybrids, and there are like pure hybrids, which stores the power from petrol in the battery, and that's not really the way forward if we want to reduce emissions. But in Europe, the plug-in hybrids are more preferred, but that's not the case in China, which is the biggest market and driver for EVs.
But as people turn to EVs, and then one would assume that oil prices would fall as a result of lessening demand, wouldn't there be an incentive for people, if there was not a policy driving it, to maybe go for a plug-in hybrid where they could get some very cheap gas?
I've got a theory, but I welcome other panelists to present their view as well.
Well, Clive, why don't you comment on that? And then
it's a personal view. I don't have the science that Alice brings with it, but a personal view, the Prius, for example, Lexus, very, very popular. Here in Hong Kong, taxis, not a lot, but they're there. Ideal in Hong Kong, you go down from the peak and it charges up and you go up again at the end of the day. Certainly suits me. In countries with farther distances that apply, in Australia, very popular, preferred over EV because of lack of charging facilities. Maybe it'll change, but I do think that Toyota's got the right idea. And friends of mine in Europe, whom I speak to in the UK and across Europe into Eastern Europe, feel the same as me. Toyota does have it right, and it solves the problem of driving long distances, or and simply to get better economy out of the whole car. And it's a very successful package that Toyota produces. Personal opinion only, not with the wisdom that you have, Alice.
But when you start putting a petrol engine into a car, which a hybrid would need, it becomes a very complicated vehicle, very heavy, lots of moving parts, and in terms of its overall life cycle, sort of efficiency and carbon footprint, actually possibly not that environmentally friendly in the long run. Is that
all true? But people will look at cost and convenience. They may spout environmental, but when it comes to running the car, taxi drivers around Hong Kong find it very satisfactory. You know what? They're the drivers, it's the owners in this place.
Are there any other things? I mean, we've mentioned maybe the charging infrastructure. Are there any other things that might possibly derail the EV revolution? Peter, do you want to? Have you got any thoughts on what might stop it? I mean, Alice has got this chart which in 2024 starts to really pick up, and then I should imagine we can all see this kind of hockey stick takeoff chart. What might derail it, though? Is there something that on the supply chain?
Just a question is, we see the graph of 2025 and the demand for EV. Do we have a similar chart for power generation and carbon footprint of power generation, sources of power? Whence cometh the juice?
I think let me phrase myself. So say in China, there hasn't the alignment of the sources of power generation with EVs, that hasn't been achieved. So nobody's saying because of the EV revolution, that's the additional amount of electricity that will be needed, and these are the these are the type of power that will supplement that. I think the IEA, they published the global energy forecast. The mix of coal and fossil fuel generation, like coal's share declined slightly, but not significantly. So if you view from that level, the energy generation story hasn't been coupled with the EV story, partly because electricity demand in EVs is just a proportion of total electricity and power demand. So that's something that's missing in the equation.
But once everyone is driving an EV, what will the proportion of electricity demand be taken up by the EV sector, by the car sector?
I haven't done the numbers, I suppose, if I spent 5 minutes, but it's a very, very good question. Thank you for asking it, because not enough people do ask that question. We live in Hong Kong. If we had a major conversion to electric vehicles, it's going to mean that Lantau and China Light and Power, plus purchases from China's nuclear plants, has got to increase significantly. If we did, we could do it back of an envelope, but it is a very good question, and I think it's not sufficiently studied. I know Hong Kong Electric and China Light and Power would have to pump a lot more coal out of those chimneys and Lantau and down there. A hell of a lot more.
On that, what would derail it, that question, I'm a bit of an optimist, so I don't think a lot about what will derail the EV revolution. But I would certainly think countries like China that have government policy and have provided subsidies in the past is a very good way to incentivize the use of the pure EV. The state of California is sort of on board with that as well, but most of the rest of the states are a long way away from creating subsidies. But I think when you have a new technology, sometimes to get it started, you need a little bit of incentive. And although I think China keeps moving the goalposts, so it used to be something like 100 kilometers on a charge, but now it's supposed to go up to 200 or 300, is it? So the goalpost for the subsidy changes, but I suppose that's a natural progression.
Absolutely. Is there going to be a Moore's law of range?
When it gets to 1,000 kilometers, then it'll stop expanding.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the supply of raw materials. Alice obviously mentioned the lithium space. A lot of lithium obviously being sourced at the moment from Argentina, from the salars down there. So do you want to talk a little bit, Gustavo, about what you're seeing in the lithium market and what Argentina's doing to
thank you,
space?
Leo. Argentina, as you all know, doesn't have a long tradition on the mining sector, but you see now that the government at the federal level and the provincial level and the local level, and I being here as an example, we are supporting the development, exploration, and prospection of lithium in Argentina. You will see more lithium commodities coming from Argentina, and of course we expect, or we would like to move up and down the value chain to add up more local production to the value chain. So in a sense, the government is fully supporting the development of the mining lithium. There's also two of the companies that are developing lithium, which are present at your show.
Yes, you have Dark Horse Resources and Lake Resources, who are both presenting here, both based in Argentina. But so you're saying that in Argentina you're going to be looking to also do some downstream processing as well, not just shipping it off to China or something?
Of course, that is the idea. There is one project signed by the province of Jujuy with an Italian company, which of course. Asia is the market. Europe and North America are playing, or even South America. We need to catch up, and of course that distance is becoming increasingly long. And of course there is economies of scale that play into this. But Argentina is trying to facilitate, not only through subsidies, but also trying to engage the science and technology and universities to try to, Argentine, Chilean, and Bolivian on the lithium triangle, they come from salares, which is not the same as the source as Australian or some other sources of lithium. So you will see also from a technological side a support from Argentine universities to try to develop that line.
And I guess you're positioning yourself as a sort of non-China source of lithium to feed into the European and North American car markets.
Yes, we don't see ourselves as competitors. There was even a project of one of BID electrical vehicles were analyzing the possibility of setting up electrical buses manufacturing facility in Argentina, and there is this idea of creating the demand locally, so the product can move up and down the value chain. So we know we are far away from the consuming markets, and you would expect some local demand to try to be strengthened in order for the lithium to be consumed in a geographical proximity to Argentina or to South America.
Are South America going to be building any gigafactories anytime soon?
I think that we will be moving closer up and down the value chain, but not that far. I mean, I think there is a learning curve on that, as well as a cost curve and a distance curve. But of course, that would be.
But there's a lot of people in Brazil. I mean, Argentina.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of people in South America who want to drive EVs one day, I guess.
Of course, but it also relates to, I would say, the average per capita income that South American nations have vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I think that's as the income per capita increases on the average in South America, there will be more of a demand on this type of vehicles. Something that it relates to the points that Alice was mentioned. I think that there's also a generational demand based on age. I think that younger people tend to be more conscious, and they will be the ones that will recreate the demand for the chain to move up and for electrical vehicles to surge forward.
Absolutely. Peter, tell us a little bit about also your company. Tell us what is your sort of role at EV Metals?
I've stepped back a couple of years.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was born in. No, but I was with Jinchuan Group before, and I was looking after the trading of copper concentrates and cathode zinc, as well as cobalt hydroxide, primarily from the DRC Congo. So I had many opportunities to go to the DRC and see not only our mines in operation, but also many others. But anyway, I parted ways with Jinchuan a year and a half ago, and since then I founded EV Metals Resources, and basically, at this stage, I'm in an advisory capacity, so I'm working with companies in the nickel and cobalt space, looking either for investors in China or looking to sell product. So basically,
I mean, that brings us nicely into talking about cobalt. Alice's prediction was saying that there's a lot of new supply that's come on stream, but there's going to be big demand in the batteries. What's your take on the cobalt, the outlook for cobalt?
Alice is entirely correct that this downturn is supply, I think very clearly supply driven. I don't think anyone could argue. And demand, really 55% growth in EV car sales in 2018. I don't think demand disappointed. Really, maybe on one point you made, I have a slight little difference of looking at it. You mentioned 2013, 2014, the low nickel price and copper price maybe disincentivized mining companies from investing. But I don't know. I think the cycle is longer than that. So I think people got very excited about cobalt back in 2006, 2007 when it hit the historical highs. And that really got things going. So when I joined Jinchuan in 2011, we were already in the midst of doing a merger or takeover of a cobalt mine, and around us there's Chinese companies everywhere in the DRC. So these things had been in play for a while, but what happened was really, I think you could say, a perfect storm of things last year. So I mean, starting with the fact that there was a lot of production that was coming on stream at the same time. Then there were some changes in Chinese government subsidy structure, also tightening of credit in China to some manufacturers, and then just this unbelievable explosion of intermediate, of sulfate and precursor production in China is all hitting at the same time. And I think it's just really bad timing, and it may take us a while to work down the stocks. Just, as I call around to manufacturers now, I think the destocking we're well on the way of getting destocked. And probably this will be an interesting year. We could see some significant bounce in cobalt price this year. I'm not predicting, back to where we were, but it's conceivable that we'll see, higher price. It's also conceivable we'll see $10 or $11 per pound, which is quite possible. So,
well, you've raised an interesting point there, which is that the fact that while at the moment it may seem that lithium is in oversupply and cobalt in oversupply, it takes a long time for mines to come online. I mean, for a Salar, or it's possibly a bit quicker, but for a new copper cobalt mine to be brought into production and discovered and then developed takes years, takes decades. And so, if we are predicting this massive ramp up of EV demand and battery demand, we can't stop investing now. Do you concur?
I entirely agree. And I think, again, a year or so ago I was speaking about the ramp up of Chinese factories, and I think we've all seen articles. There's something like 50 or more, or is it 100 mega factories, for producing batteries, and all of this capacity just seems way overboard. But I found just over the years I've been living in China that China has this tendency to build it and they will come mentality, and I think that there will be a consolidation. There will be many players that will not exist in a few years from now, but I think the ones who do will have plenty of customers for the product. It's definitely, you've got to take a longer term view.
I mean, it's a common fact that people underestimate the size of China. And a few years ago, you'll remember people talking about ghost cities, where there were whole cities and blocks of flats built, which with no one living in them, and everyone couldn't imagine. They say, I'm driving past these blocks of flats, and I can't imagine that these will ever be full. And then you go back a few years later, and they're all full, and they're building more, apparently. Anyway, but
oh yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm monopolizing. One quick point. Also, cobalt for most of us, probably in this room, we recognize that it's a minor metal. It's a very tiny little metal that was very boring for a long time, and EV made it, a superstar. But in the reality, I mean, 2018, the production of mined cobalt was 125 or 127,000 tons, refined maybe 114. 2019, we'll be seeing perhaps 153,000, 54,000 tons of mined cobalt, refined maybe 127,000. But compared to base metals, I mean, it's such a small amount. So if last year the surplus was estimated to be 7,000 tons, and this year, I'm not exactly sure, but we could have a surplus of maybe 15,000. But that's a very small number that's driving this kind of huge price decrease. So it's the nature of a small metal.
yeah, that's just a few shipping containers falling off a ship somewhere in an Atlantic storm or something. And you're back to balanced.
You asked a question that didn't get answered about what can disrupt this whole EV thing. And I think one very, very real thing is that because 66% of the cobalt comes from the Congo, and that ain't a very stable place, if that goes to hell, your EV market goes to hell. Maybe not forever, and it'll certainly probably the ship will probably right itself eventually, but that could be a disruptive force in this whole EV space.
Any comments on that? I mean, if the DRC does, have a civil war or something like that, or Katanga province tries to break away, and then there's a big clampdown or something could happen. Where would the cobalt come from? Would we have enough?
It's an excellent point. And in fact, that was one item I left off my list of the perfect storm, because in fact, the election, and I'm happy the election went fairly uneventfully for the people of the DRC, but I think many people were expecting that things could get really, really rough at the end of last year, and so far, thankfully, it's been fairly calm. But yeah, the DRC is, 72% of the world cobalt supply came from the DRC last year, up from 65. And this year, we're looking maybe 75%. So it's just massive, and it's a huge disrupting factor. And I agree entirely, and I don't have a prescription for what we would do. But I guess we should keep stockpiling,
Keep stockpiling, exactly. Because it's not, as you say, it's not a big stockpile. It's not very much. Let's talk about nickel a little bit. We have one of the leading nickel experts sat on the panel here, Clive. Alice mentioned in her presentation this HPAL project down in Indonesia that has, claims that it can produce very low-cost nickel sulfate. What's your take on that?
Yes, that would help. I think people have underestimated what can happen. The one we're speaking of is headed by Xinjiang at Morowali, and in very short time they have not only built and operate nickel pig iron production, but to my utter amazement, a stainless steel mill that has the capability of producing 3 million tonnes, a bit more nickel, and it will be up from the present 2.2 to 3 million tonnes. That's 6% of the world's production in one location. Very sophisticated equipment, built in northern China, taken to Fujian, trialled, put on a barge, heavy lift, and operates. I've walked the floor. You see a picture of cold roll stainless with myself next to it, entitled Happy Metallurgists. So it's on that site that the HPAL plant will be built. There has been much from analysts, including the article in the Assay from my good friend Jim Lennon, who expresses amazement at the capex. But people don't realise that you were talking about an area which has all of the infrastructure, the power, the port. The mine, the cost of the mines is not included because they're all subcontractors. And front-end loaders, a small 5-ton truck and a barge, and there's your raw material. That's not included in the capex. The equipment which will be built in China can be built in very short time. And the capex there is assigned to the China side, not the Indonesian side. So there's amazement that you could produce 50,000 tonnes nickel content of MHP and take it through to nickel sulfate and cobalt sulfate for 700 and a bit million. I say you can, because I've walked the floor, speak to the people, and it will start to operate in April of next year. That's the claim, and I believe it to be true. So I am quite contrary to most analysts, but it is because as you know, my business is in selling nickel, servicing those sales throughout Southeast Asia. We have the biggest distribution footprint in this part of the world, and it's nickel, nickel sulfate, nickel chemicals. And I've seen it with my own two eyes, and I hope I'm sufficiently across nickel sulfate to know what they're talking about. Also, cobalt sulfate. So my short answer is, by subtraction of the mine, the site, the equipment, that sum of money is valid, and I believe that to be true that it will start to operate in April next year.
And what will that do for the nickel sulfate and cobalt sulfate markets?
It will just support the continued growth that is necessary. We do have a slide if you want to screen it. So the demand for nickel sulfate is continuing to grow. Thank you very much. Am I in the way of the slide?
No,
I think I might be. I'll just exit. So where are we? So looking at demand, and then we'll come to source. Nickel sulfate has traditionally been plating, which is my business. So I've got the stuff under my fingernails together with cobalt sulfate. And that's about 160,000 tonnes gross weight of nickel sulfate. This one here is expressed as nickel content, so that's about 35,000 tonnes for plating. That grows very nicely. It's about 4.5 to 5% per annum. But the big growth is going to be in the lithium-ion batteries. There is already significant sulfate used in nickel metal hydrides and the good, ever-reliable nickel cadmiums, which we find in aircraft because they're safe. Well, at least the A350. So that's our view, together with my good friends from Roskill, on where we see the growth of nickel sulfate consumption being driven by the lithium-ion battery. Mm-hmm. Question is, where will it come from? And I think we have another bar chart, if you can, please. Demand.
Supply.
So here is a big question from the point of view of investors. Where is it going to come from? Recycle, we look at 2018, the integrated producers, who are the two main ones are Norils Nickel, who have a superb refinery at Harjavalta, Finland, and with Sumitomo. I speak with some affection to those because we sell their products. We do technical service and we do independent analysis on it. So the integrated producers in blue, external processing, there are people who buy feedstock, and that's the big source these days. So those people rely on the best products for making nickel sulfate is a mixed hydroxide product, but it's very limited in supply. Ramu in Papua New Guinea, 32,000 tonnes of nickel content, was a major source, but that's not available anymore because they're putting the whole lot into their new chemical plant in Tangshan. So there's not much other nickel MHP available. MHP being nickel content, say 32, 35%. Cobalt will come through from the ore bodies. At Papua New Guinea, Ramu, we've got 10%, and the lesser ones, 6%, and that's what will happen in Tsingshan. So when we look at nickel from those green ones, there's cobalt with it, and there's a lot of cobalt around. That, I think, is underestimated. New projects, I've coloured there in grey, they are projects which need to come on board. The extension of the green ones is not existing ones, but companies who have announced that they will have a project. So green is what we think will happen if those announcements come to fulfilment. Grey is the area available and very necessary to fill the gap.
How big is that grey bar there? Is that
a bit hard to say, isn't it? Say about nickel content 100,000 tonnes, which would produce, roughly speaking, 450,000 tonnes gross weight of nickel sulfate, which has 22.3% nickel. So for companies that we have here today and others in the world who are looking at, have not yet announced, the green ones, the announced and existing, the grey area is where the opportunity lies for new companies to come on board. And if you can bring an HPAL on up to speed, as the Chinese will do, in my belief, in under 2 years, that can be switched on very carefully. There are also other methods of making nickel, the feedstock for nickel sulfate, which I call agricultural, but they will come on board too, and they're very low capex, very low opex. And where will it come from? When you walk the projects in Indonesia, you realise just how much is available. I used to work for Inco, and so although I'm a secondary metallurgist and I'm in marketing, my colleagues in PT, Inco, now Vale, all the properties that we're seeing developed now were our properties. They were not developed, and they've been taken back by the government and released. You will be amazed how much can be brought on stream between now and 2025. And I'm looking beyond the ones that are announced. by walking the plots.
Something,
Yes, go ahead.
something you mentioned to me, was Mincor Managing Director David Southam was reported to have said in Perth, he said, with respect to nickel content in battery, our firm belief is that the overwhelming trend is for high nickel content batteries that will predominantly be sourced from nickel sulfide rather than laterite ores.
Yes, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because one of the purest forms of sulfate is Norilsk nickel, which is at Harjavalta in Finland, and that uses superb technology from Outotec, one of the biggest refineries in the world of the purest form, which, by the way, purity equals premium. You want to make money in this game, you make purity, and you get the highest premium. I'll just branch a little onto that, if I may, and I'll answer the question. Nickel sulfate, there's no such thing as battery grade or any other differentiation. It is nickel units, which when dissolved are nickel ions. It's all an electrochemical process. The plating bath, the current goes that way, and the battery goes that way, and it's recharged that way. It's exactly the same. They abide by Faraday's law. There is no such thing as battery grade nickel sulfate. It's a purity level, and the purity that you're concerned with is based upon foreign bodies like calcium, magnesium, which will short-circuit the battery or upset the plating process. So first thing is there's no battery grade. That's a falsehood. It is nickel sulfate. What is your purity? The best sulfate available is Sumitomo and Harjavalta, and they get the highest premiums. So if you're going to go in the nickel business, it's one thing to get it out of the ground, but how much money are you going to get when you sell it? You can sell it as metal and get LME plus, but you make it as sulfate, and you would be amazed how much money you can make. And that will continue for the highest of purities.
How much money can you make? What is the premium at the moment?
You want to write me an order? We start at 2,500 and we go up to 4,500. We sell metal, very pure metal for plating, a premium of 1,400, 1,600. But if you sell melting nickel briquettes and that, you're lucky to get 200, 300. CIF basis. So you're shipping at LME minus. So, but in China, the lower purity levels will get you 400 to 700. That's the best you can get.
Right.
But you go for high purity, you got real money. Because of the battery goes better, the plating bath goes better. Now we come to your question. The best material is, in fact, from sulfide ores in Russia, and it's a matte and it's refined. But it doesn't matter whether it comes from a sulfide or a laterite. It is the nickel ions that you're chasing, and then the level of purity is simply what you do. You do solvent extraction, you exclude all of the nasties like calcium, magnesium, aluminium, silicon, and the alkali metals, and then you look at getting rid naturally of copper and zinc and arsenic and beryllium. So I'm sorry to say, but that statement is a falsehood. It's got nothing to do with what was taken out of the ground. You can take a laterite or a sulfide and you can make highly pure or impure according to how much money you want to spend on processing. So the two best brands of nickel sulfate are, one is from a sulfide ore, Russian ore it happens to be, and the other is Sumitomo, who take it as laterite ores out of the Philippines and ship it as a mixed sulfide product. So I'm sorry to say, but there have been some people ask me to this conference, why sulfide ores? So I had to scratch my head because a lot of people mispronounce sulfide and sulfate. So only understanding Australian accents, I had to scratch my head, but happily there are people from Perth, so I could understand what they're saying.
Is there a difference in cost of production between a sulfide and a laterite? Producing from?
In an established operation like Norilsk, they can do it cheaper than anybody because the sulfide ore that they have carries platinum, palladium, Cobalt, biggest palladium producer in the world. So they can produce that nickel at LME minus 2,000. So in that case, yes. But if it's BHP at Kwinana, who are taking a sulfide ore, then making a hydrometallurgical powder and dissolving that, that's already LME plus, because they could sell the powder LME plus. And then because it's not pure enough, having to purify it, so boy, that's a tough way to go. Really got nothing to do with the ore body. It's what you do with it. And the quick answer to your question is they're about equal.
But you don't want impurities in your nickel in your batteries, do you? What happens if
No,
they
what
are
happens?
impure?
A very, very interesting question, because the main one is calcium. And calcium is a sulfate, is a peculiar chemical because it precipitates at temperature and redissolves at room temperature. You go up to 60 and it precipitates. All others that I know of do the reverse. Precipitate at room temperature, warm them up, and they dissolve. So here you have a problem with the battery. There's the battery, if we work our phones, they get pretty warm. And the same happens with the lithium-ion battery. In fact, so much so that in the Boeing 787, they caught fire in the air because they were working hard during the landing process with putting down the gear. So a battery can get very hot. You do that, and the calcium precipitates, and it'll cross over and short it out. That's the beginning of a fire. So impurities are much overlooked by producers. But when you get to the end user, that's when you find they'll cut the premium down and you're out of business.
So how should investors play this space right now?
Across all metals?
Across the batteries space. I mean, should they be heading for the hills, or should they be taking this opportunity to buy while things are cheap?
Can I lead off?
If
Jump in now. The nickel is where there's the biggest, in my view, the biggest opportunity. Firstly, you have volume. If you go up to 811, that illustrates my point. That's molecular weight, of course, not percentage. And so the volume is there. Demand will be met by people who are quick off the mark, and the Chinese in Indonesia are doing that, and you will be amazed how easily it is to bring it up. And every time you dig out of the saprolite or the limonite, whichever you choose, or you can mix the two as they do in Ramu, in New Guinea you get a 10-to-1 ratio. In Indonesia you'll get about 6% nickel to 100 of, sorry, cobalt 100. I can put my fingers on 700 tons of cobalt today. All you've got to do is, it's already been mined, it's sitting there. All you've got to do is shove it in a dissolution process and you've got it. So mining, processing nickel is very, very attractive. The market is there. The grey side tells you how much has still got to be, is open to anyone who wishes. And I think with the EV demand, later on maybe stationary power. Demand is there, it's nice and easy stuff, and it'll reward you if you go for purity and you get the premium.
John, the lithium space, what would you say to investors at the moment who are asking for your advice? Should they be looking at this? Should they be investing in lithium at the moment, or is it just too oversupplied?
Can I defer to our lithium expert? I'm really more prepared to speak on the cobalt.
Tell me about cobalt then.
Well, Clive reminded me of something very important, and I think it's good to mention to investors, is the byproduct credits for all of these minerals are crucially important. So if I'm investing if my aim is to invest in cobalt, and I'm either going to get into cobalt via nickel or via cobalt, or in fact, as there is one of the exhibitors here is also mining for cobalt itself, which is unusual. But I mean, for the most part, most of the copper mines that I visit regularly are not as low cost as you might expect. And even coming from my own previous company, there were a few years ago, without those cobalt byproduct credits, we would have had to shut down. So it's a real risk. So I would really look for your lowest cost nickel production, and with it comes the cobalt. But if both the nickel and cobalt prices are low, you're sunk. So simply just cost is king.
But right now, as a potential sort of entry point into the market, prices falling further, or wait a little bit, or jump in?
I think my view is sooner or later prices come up again and they may bounce. There's speculative interest. I think the auto companies are already busy trying to make deals to lock in production going forward. They probably wouldn't like to get product for a few years into the future, but perhaps they're willing to put money down now to secure that. So yeah, I think you could jump in now, or you could maybe take a step back and wait a little while.
And lithium, tell us about what do you think? Is it a good time to invest in the lithium market?
Well, I really wouldn't know. I mean, because it's time in the market. I mean, who as an investor knows how to time in the market? I mean, we have to look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, see where we are in terms of that, and make our own calculations. I mean, I would say that supply is coming on. I mean, you will get more supply coming on stream. Now, I really don't know how would the aggregates play, and also there is many questions as to what are the in which direction technologies will go in a way that would ask, well, we would need this material or this other material. So not only we would have to look at the international demand and supply of the product, but we'd also have to forecast which technologies are going to come onto streams. On that, Leo, I would ask Alice I would defer to Alice as the expert.
Are the batteries going to change, or are we stuck with lithium ion for the foreseeable?
For the time being, because a lot of buying and investment are in lithium ion, and any transition to new technology, we see players positioning themselves in fuel cell, in lithium metal, sort of solid state batteries, but running through tests in a lab is different from producing them on a commercial scale. So within lithium-ion battery, the shift is whether to shift towards higher nickel and less cobalt. It doesn't have much of an impact on lithium demand because the consumption is fairly stable across different battery types, but it has a big impact on cobalt and nickel.
But I think it's true that the next generation of batteries anyway use more lithium, the solid state batteries, and certainly the lithium metal technologies, which are fairly hard to do anyway, because lithium metal on its own is fairly volatile. They would use a lot more lithium, I think is the...
I would be partial, and I would say yes, do invest in lithium in Argentina.
There we go. Fantastic. Do we have any final questions from the audience before we wrap this thing up? Question in the middle? Rick?
Yeah, just I think so the next dimension on the EV space is something that hasn't been talked about here at least, was the autonomous vehicle, which will make it far easier to drive around the cities and requires a huge amount of AI to work. Obviously Google and Volkswagen and lots of companies are working on that space. It's not perfected, of course, but it will be. And I think that's another dimension on the whole EV thing, which will be far easier than, also goes to, I think somebody made the point about the generational aspect. My kid doesn't like to drive anymore. He likes to be driven. So he rides Uber, and I like that because then he doesn't drink and drive. But Uber's going to get rid of the drivers next. And I think that's going to make it a hell of a lot easier to get around places like Hong Kong. I know in Vancouver, which is a nice city, but it is a total pain in the butt to drive there because the roads are already at capacity. So I think that's another dimension to this whole EV direction, making everything autonomous. And in the cities, it'll make things a lot easier. I think on the roads, you're going to see autonomous trucks self-driving. I mean, Elon's already got one in the works. So I think that's just the next dimension to the whole EV space.
We have 4 more seconds.
Go ahead.
There was on the same point. There was an article recently talking about with the autonomous vehicles. Once they drop you off, if they don't have another pickup, they're just going to keep driving around the block, and so you're just going to have gridlock in every major city.
But my theory on this, and this is just my personal theory, is that once you have autonomous vehicles and you have transport on demand, vehicles on demand system, you don't need 5 seats in these vehicles. So you would tap in, I've got just 2 people or just 1 person, and a 1-person pod will pull up. Because at the moment, the reason the streets are in gridlock during rush hour is that you've got big cars with only 1 person in each car. So it's possible to, and also with autonomous vehicles, you could potentially drive a lot closer without sort of crashing into each other and things like that. You don't have to park them. That is true. But it does raise a valid issue, because people want to go to work all at the same time. You would have this situation where suddenly everybody's wanting a car or a vehicle or one of these pods, and then while everyone's in their office, what are these things doing? They're off sort of driving around having fun. Exactly. Anyway, on that note, I think that's enough sort of futurology for this session. But sounds like there's still plenty of juice in the battery materials space. So if you haven't gone and met them, there's lots of companies next door who are developing projects to power the future EV revolution. So can I have a big round of applause for our panelists?